Yeah.
Okay, so this will be our first class on The Air We Breathe by Glenn Scrivener. The little subtitle here, How We All Came to Believe in Freedom, Kindness, Progress, and Equality. And we're not going to jump directly into chapter 1 because the first time we do a new book, you never can tell who's read what just yet. So I always try to give us some kind of introductory or organizational class, and then we kind of agree together, okay, let's do chapter 1 for next week, or sometimes the chapters are real brief, we do chapters 1 and 2. Remember Pilgrim's Progress? We were doing multiple chapters for every class because they're, they might have been 2 pages, some of them. These are long, these are more substantial. We're just going to do 1 chapter at a time, but that's the kind of thing that I think makes the most sense when we can kind of look at each other and say, okay, and here we go. So the other thing is, if you are watching this and you're wondering why you hear all the disembodied voices, but you're only looking at me, that the camera angle has changed very substantially, the answer is yes, it has. So we're just experimenting during this class to try to ensure that we get as much vocal quality on the boundary mic as possible. We're encouraging people to sit a little bit closer to that, but this way nobody has to worry about, am I inadvertently on the camera or not? So the camera is just on me, but we actually have a nice full room of people today. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I make 10. So this is a nice, good group. I am really looking forward to this book. It's very different than anything we've done recently.
Yeah.
And so we're just going to talk about it for a second. Bruce, you were going to say something about the book.
To me, that was a whole new way of looking at things. He started out with what amounts to a new way to look at things.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's an old way for us, but it's a new way.
Very much so. And so I'm not a big introduction guy in books. Prefaces and introductions are real hit and miss for me. Most of the time they're miss. Sometimes they just feel like an addition after the fact that the publisher said, you know what, I want you to write 4 pages of an introduction. And it kind of feels like it's real disconnected from the book, and they kind of did it just because they were supposed to. I like this introduction because I think there's a real practicality to it. He basically says, I'm going to make a surprising case that you might not have considered, or you might not realize, or you might have thought at one point and forgotten, or have started to disbelieve. But in order to make my case, I'm going to lay my cards on the table, and I'm going to show you, first we're going to do this, then we're going to do this, then we're going to do this. And I think that's actually very instructive about how we can approach the book. It gives us a real good sense of what we're going to be talking about and how he's going to methodically go piece at a time and try to make an argument for his proposal, as well as kind of anticipate what some of the initial questions are going to be. And it feels very nice and very thorough. The other useful part of this is all of us around the table are churchgoers and are members of St. Stephen's. This book is written to appeal to a very broad group of people. Basically, if you're interested at all in this topic, he's written in such a way to give you the best chance possible to connect to it. Whether you are a regular churchgoer, whether you never go to church, whether you used to go to church, if you are willing to engage his premise. And the premise is basically here in the Western world, and by that he's basically meaning the Western Hemisphere, he's meaning Europe, the Americas, those other countries that are deeply influenced by this. He is apparently an Australian, which I didn't realize until I read the book. But that our culture is so thoroughly and inextricably linked to the gospel and the church that we've almost lost the ability to see it. And all the things that we take for granted have their foundations in what for a lot of people may be a very surprising place. As a matter of fact, the critiques of the church or of religion are almost always founded on the principles of the church and religion, whether people realize that or not. Let me put that in a slightly more practical way. This is a psychological phenomenon that seems to hold true for an awful lot of people in an awful lot of circumstances. You ever meet someone, it could be in a group or it could be at an event or something like that, but somebody that you have to kind of interact with for a decent amount, but for the first time, and they just rub you the wrong way. You ever felt that? There's just something about them that just sort of kind of pushes a button. There is a psychological principle to suggest there is a very high probability or a very high likelihood of the times that happens that the things that annoy us the most in other people are the things in ourselves that we like the least.
Yeah.
If there's something about us, a trait or a habit about ourselves that we don't like, we really pick up on it on other people and we really dislike it. And aren't we actually kind of communicating something about ourselves? So basically, there are a lot of criticism and critiques about the church out there. It takes almost nothing to find people saying, well, this is wrong, or this is bad, or this is backwards, or whatever it is. But even the scale of judgment being used has been influenced by the gospel in the church in ways that people don't even notice anymore. His initial metaphor to describe what it is like to be someone living in the Western world and our relationship to the gospel in the church is a fish in water. And that's kind of the old aphorism, does a fish even know that it's wet? Well, to the fish, no, because that is the medium in which they exist. We do not feel surrounded by air, unless the wind is blowing maybe, but we are surrounded by air, and actually we need to be surrounded by air. If we are going to breathe, we have to have a certain concentration of oxygen around us that we absolutely cannot see, and we frankly can't measure. We can't measure without tools that are helping us to realize whether the room that we're in is going to be good and healthy for us, or whether we're going to eventually pass out. You've heard about people in homes having carbon monoxide poisoning. And what that does is it actually forces out the oxygen from our body to be able to process it. We can choke in a room filled with air. And carbon monoxide poisoning is actually so dangerous and insidious because you can't see it, can't smell it. If you are in an area that has radon, it's a similar sort of thing. You can't see it around you, but it's having this effect on you. So the oxygen that we breathe, that we absolutely need in order to survive. We don't feel it. We don't see it. We basically take it for granted. But we also have a lot of trouble noticing exactly how much there is around us, what the concentration is. Like I said, unless we have some specialized tools, do you know that you have enough oxygen in the air concentration around us, or are we going to start feeling lightheaded? Are we going to fall asleep? Are we going to suffocate and die? These are things that we assume, no, we're fine. Because why wouldn't we be fine? We're in a room. Yeah, I mean, we're in a kind of a closed room, but we're just, outside is right there, and it's not like it's all sealed up, and we have no reason to think otherwise. So this is a lot after generation upon generation, 2,000 years of the West, for the most part, being formed by the gospel and church. Assumptions have been made that just aren't even considered anymore. We don't even think about them. We just simply assume them. Where did those assumptions come from? Are they universal? Is this just a state of humanity in the world? Or are those assumptions, do they have an origin point? That before that origin point, there would be different assumptions. Not no assumptions, but different. Maybe very different. So he is going to lay out this case. He is mentioning the West, not to say West versus East, but just to kind of give us a shorthand that even though this is a relatively comprehensive account, it's not super crazy deep. You could write, obviously, giant textbooks about this kind of stuff. So if we're going to do a survey of the information, he is making it as relatable to us as possible. If you grew up in Pakistan, this might make a little less sense and it might need a little more translation. Anybody grow up in Pakistan? No. Anyone grow up in Laos or Vietnam? Okay, so there's an assumption made that his readers, for the most part, have a kind of a common background. That the fact that I grew up in Central Florida versus somebody who grew up in New York, yeah, we're still going to have enough of the same worldview. But this is not necessarily as direct as somebody who maybe grew up in the Far East, or obviously somebody who grew up 1,500 years ago. So Glenn Scribner is a Church of England priest. He is ordained through the Church of England, working in England. I don't think he does direct parish ministry. I do know that he is responsible for evangelism and especially kind of new media evangelism. So he's got kind of a, I don't know if you call it a diocesan job, but it's more of a programmatic job than it is a parish-based job. So he does a lot of the production of videos and books and teaching series, and does a lot of direct engagement with people, asking sometimes the very basic questions about the faith. An evangelist is one who spreads the euangelion, the good news. The good news, the gospel. That's what gospel simply means. And so he is talking to people about Jesus, the nature of Jesus, the history of Jesus, our relationship. And to do so in a culture, this is the contemporary Western culture, though he, in his particular context, it is mostly in England, but because he's doing new media, this is obviously on the internet. It could be anybody watching in any place. But with some cultural assumptions and cultural biases. England in particular, the statistics for church going are even worse than they are in America. And we can look at our own statistics and go, oh no, fewer people are going to church all the time. And oh no, more people are doing this or less people are doing that. Well, a lot of Europe, and England is a part of that as well, are ahead of the curve on us as far as considering themselves sort of post-Christian. No, that doesn't mean there aren't churches in England. That doesn't mean there.
Sorry, what's post-Christian?
Post-Christian meaning rather than being an overtly Christian culture, we are past that. That's in our rear view mirror. We used to have an overtly Christian culture, but that's in the past. We now have a culture that it was influenced by that, but it's no longer a direct assumption. So
Then what is it?
that's an excellent question. So to be post-Christian is going to be a part of what we'll be talking about.
Okay.
It is to have different assumptions that in a culture that you used to, but not necessarily assumptions that are, some of your assumptions have grown directly for the assumptions you used to have. They're directly related, but you can forget that. Sometimes, well, we don't do that anymore, but the assumptions you have are first cousins, brothers and sisters to the assumptions that you used to have. But if you forget that, if you think, well, no, this is just the way we see things now, you can miss out on the ways in which the culture is similar and different because you assume it's all different, but it's not, it isn't. That's not a super helpful way to put it, I'm sure, but we can take some assumptions from our own culture from the last, few decades or whatever. If we were to go back in time 30, 40 years, even in this area, or maybe where you come from or where you lived 30 years ago, whatever it might be. What was life in your town like Sunday at 10 a.m.? Any given Sunday at 10 a.m. What was it like? Was it like Monday morning at 10 a.m.? It was different. How was it different? Was it like Saturday morning at 10 a.m.? No, I don't think so. Sunday mornings, especially some time ago, felt different. It was the weekend, so people weren't at work, but people also weren't out mowing the lawn and going to ball games. And that Sunday morning it was sort of carved out to feel different. There was an assumption that you were either personally going to church or other people were going to church. And if you didn't, it's not that you had to or else, but there's definitely an assumption. Well, that's what Sunday mornings are for. Go to church. You don't schedule kids' soccer games Sunday morning. Who would do that? The kids are in church. The parents are taking them to church. Well, what is it like now? There's stuff going on everywhere. As a matter of fact, sometimes the weekends for families in particular are even busier because, there's no school, so let's put in all this other stuff. That is a different assumption as a culture, because it's not just one person or a dozen people. It's like everywhere you look. And it's changed the way that people can make some of these broader decisions with their lives. Anybody know what a blue law is?
No.
So a blue law.
No drinks on Sunday.
Yeah, a blue law is basically it's a legal, it's a real law, but it's based on a moral presupposition rather than kind of a criminal offense. So blue laws are basically community standard laws. And for a long time, there were lots of blue laws about Sundays. We have some vestiges of blue laws right now. If you want to go to Publix on a Sunday morning and buy a bottle of wine or buy a case of beer, it's got to be like 11 o'clock or 12 o'clock or whatever. There's a sign. There's a sign right there on the case. So that was a law that was passed whoever knows how long ago, generations maybe, that basically said drinking and Sundays don't mix. The Sunday is a holy day and drinking is not holy. Therefore, if you have to drink, you're going to do it in the other 6 days. But our community standard is we are not going to condone or serve alcohol on these certain times.
Well, I remember no stores, nothing was open on Sunday. It was a day of rest. It was a day of,
That's right.
yeah, nothing was open.
There was a period of time where the first few stores opened on Sundays, and that was seen as a kind of surprising. And it was sort of like an emergency, maybe. Remember when there was a stretch of a few years where all of the big stores that used to have Black Friday early morning sales started opening up on Thanksgiving Day. That used to be unheard of. Everybody was closed on Thanksgiving Day. The big sales were the next day, and then they started having them early in the morning. There's a doorbuster at 7 a.m. There's a doorbuster at 5 a.m. You ever do like an early morning Black Friday? I did it a few times for the experience, like to say that I did it. But then a store said, well, if we open on Thanksgiving, we'll be the only game in town. We'll make even more money. Well, then once one of them did it, and then another one did it. And then all of them started feeling the pressure. If we stay closed on Thanksgiving, we're missing out on what everyone else is getting, and we're going to be behind. And so suddenly they start opening as well. And it took a few years of that until there was a backlash where people said, you know what, this is nuts. I don't really want to go out and getting an extra few dollars off isn't worth it. And The employees are complaining, and frankly, I think they've got a right to complain. Let's all agree that they need to have the day off. But there's still some places that are open on Thanksgiving Day. But that pendulum kind of swung, right? So these are some kind of broad cultural assumptions that have changed within our own lifetime. So to circle back to Glenn Scrivener writing in England, writing to a post-Christian audience is meaning talking to people who assume that Sunday morning is just a day off of work and school that you fill with something. Not church. You can if you want, but that is an option amongst many, and frankly, not a particularly interesting option. So he is writing and communicating first and foremost to a culture that is maybe even slightly more hostile to the church and church going than we are. We certainly have changed just within my lifetime. So these are the ways in which our culture is continuing to drift from a place that they used to be to a place where we kind of are now, and in a direction which we don't know where it's going next. So anyway, as he is seeking to speak to a culture that is less and less familiar with the church, the job of evangelism changes. If you go to church or have gone to church, I might use words to talk about my church that even if you don't know them exactly, I can explain them to you relatively briefly. You could have two very, very different churches. Like, pick on the Baptist church right up the road from us. It's right there in Christina. I could say, oh yes, well, every Sunday we have the Eucharist. And somebody who has gone to the Baptist church for many years could say, you have the Eucharist what? They don't know that word. That is, well, and I could say, well, the sacrament. What? They don't, that's not a terminology they use because they've got kind of a different frame of reference. But it wouldn't take me too long to say, to figure out a way to explain it that we've got some common ground. I could say, okay, the Lord's Supper. Oh, yeah, we do that quarterly. The Lord's Supper with the grape juice as well. I mean, with wine. Wine, why would you use wine? Well, okay. And then we start talking about the gospel account of the Last Supper. We start talking about the upper room and the disciples, and suddenly we've got all sorts of common ground to talk about, and boom, we know. We apply something differently. We use different terminology, but it only took a couple of steps for us to get back onto the same page. Now imagine that someone has never gone to church in their life. They have grown up wherever they've grown up, and they've just kind of gone about their business. And I said, well, we have the Eucharist at church on Sunday, and none of it makes any sense. Well, the Eucharist, the sacrament, I don't even know that word. The Lord's Supper, what Lord? Supper, like, is that the meal? Like, I had hamburgers last night for supper. Is that what you're talking about? Yeah. No. Like when Jesus was with his disciples at the Last Supper, first of all, what upper room? Upper what? And then why was it the Last Supper? Like, did he go somewhere? All of these the bread and the wine. Bread and wine, like a baguette? Was there cheese? Were there grapes? Was it like a charcuterie board? Suddenly the common ground, you have to keep going lower and lower and lower before you find something fundamental enough where people can start speaking a common language. As the culture changes from, say, a more Christian or Christianized culture to a post-Christian culture, a lot of that overlapping common ground is either lost or just kind of gets a little buried. So writing and ministering in a culture that you have to kind of explain everything from its basics. is a bit of a different kind of evangelism than you might expect. Almost being an overseas missionary, but right at home. You know, we might have thought years or generations ago about, oh, there's this people group that's been unreached by the gospel and they need to hear about Jesus for the first time. So we're going to send in missionaries to explain who Jesus is. And we might conjure an image of somebody living on an island deep in the Pacific. We might think about a tribe of people deep within the inner recesses of a continent that don't interact with the outside, or in a hidden valley on a mountain. It's like, well, no, they're actually in Bartow, and they've just never gone to church, and they don't know anything about it. So the job of the evangelist now, even within a culture that's no longer foreign to us, because it's our culture, our language, our neighbors, but the foreign element is the understanding and the identification of the gospel, of doctrine, of theology, of church going. We use all sorts of little words and phrases in the church without thinking about it because we're used to it. Somebody who doesn't go to church, and I mentioned the liturgy, and it means less than nothing. It's almost a turn-off word because it just sounds crazy. The more you explain it, forget. It's too complicated. So the culture, a post-Christian culture, doesn't have to be hostile to the church. It doesn't have to say, how dare you worship God? You better not go to church on a Sunday. We better close. It just has to be indifferent. And indifference then leads to growing further and further away. The greater that distance becomes, not just the less communication there is, and you have to explain things more, but you tend to forget. You can maybe imagine a story like you might have read in a novel or seen in a movie. It's a trope, especially of those Hallmark Christmas movies, where you've got typically a young woman in the big city, and she's working at this high-powered something or other. It's advertising firm, it's a law firm, she's an executive of some sort, but then through some sort of convoluted, and she probably has a boyfriend, and he's like a real mover and a shaker, and he's like this real slick character. But then through some sort of convoluted circumstances, she winds up back home in Podunk, Arizona, or in the hoots and the hollers of Kentucky, or whatever it is, and back home. And she feels like she's a fish out of water because I work in the big city and I have high-powered meetings, and my boyfriend, drives this fancy car. And then suddenly she has to bump into the local boy, and at first they don't like each other, and then they fall in love. And then she starts remembering how sweet it was to be in this community where people knew each other and they loved each other. And then the boyfriend always comes, and there's always some sort of kerfuffle. And then she has to make the decision, I remember where I came from. And that might be 30 to 40 different movies with the exact same plot. But remembering where you come from will be a lot of what this book will be introducing. Sometimes things that we within the church knew, sometimes things we within the church are like, I've never seen it, never kind of put two and two together that way. But for people outside of the church, some of this might be rather shocking. Never considered how many of these assumptions that they had that came directly from Christian faith. That's something they have no identification with. Why would what I think have anything at all to do with church? I don't go to church. I don't want to go to church. My parents didn't go to church. So why would I have this basic assumption about life? Why would I have these principles and priorities that have anything at all to do with the gospel? It seems very unreal to them because they're the girl who went to the big city and got so consumed in a completely different lifestyle, they forgot where they came from. So this will be, in essence, trying to remember where we came from. Again, he's laid out, there's various things that he plans to do. It's kind of topical as we're going to go through chapter by chapter. There, he comes with a list. Actually, the list is, I think, pretty interesting, and he sort of lays it out in a way that so there are 7 values central. He says, to the modern outlook, equality, compassion, consent, enlightenment, science, freedom, and progress are in the fingers. Reading over that list, that is from what is that, page 16. Does that sound off at all to you? If there were contemporary virtues that are general culture, reading online, watching on TV, seeing it in a paper, wherever it is, that seems to be considered significant, these are important. Does that list of virtues seem correct to you? Contemporary people value these things. Okay, so we often value as a culture different things at different times. C.S. Lewis has a very kind of a famous framework that he refers to as chronological snobbing, where he basically says it's very easy to look in the past and kind of look down on that because we have progressed from where they are. And that way, if we have progressed, that means that they are somehow behind us or deficient. When the reality is, by and large, people are people. Human nature hasn't changed. Technology changes, and there can be progress in various areas, but what it tends to be is we tend to concentrate on the things that we have chosen are important to us right now and neglect the other things. A different time, a different place, a different culture would have a different list of things that they prioritize, and they could very easily look at us and say, look at those miserable idiots who don't do these other things. They're all concentrating on stuff that's less important. I can create a website. I cannot shoe a horse. The fact that I can't shoe a horse but can create a website is relatively in my favor in 2024. In 1884, I'm the dummy because nobody cares about websites, but shoeing a horse is actually incredibly significant. And that's a technology change, but we can go backwards in time for what cultures value. Would you think that we live in a culture now that values the closeness of extended family or not?
No, I don't think they value it not like it used to be.
Yeah, there's definitely a difference. Definitely a difference. There was a time and a place where family, even if they moved away, they'd still kind of lived together and they shared time together. Maybe they came together for Sunday meals or whatever it was. Or it wasn't surprising to have, grandparents live with families or extended relatives all live in a big house. As a matter of fact, go into other cultures and it's almost an assumption. You don't grow up and move away. You grow up and you just find a different room in this house. Where my where my father-in-law grew up in Peru, in Lima, his brother, who became an architect, lived in the house that they grew up in. And with each successive generation that was added, he built a new floor onto the home. And it's now a 3-story home that was built up over the years because once they would have children, and those children start to get older. Well, those children get older and marry. So what do? Well, let's build a second floor so they can live here. And those children get older, and it was just the assumption we all live together. That was considered significant and important, still is in that particular culture. And I would say, what about here? Not like that. Not like that. As a matter of fact, we as a people seem so unsettled and move so frequently and so much. It's not at all uncommon to not have any family anywhere near you. Sometimes, and that's great. It's certainly been our choice to be around family as much as possible. But I know a lot of people, my kids live one's in Colorado and one's in Minnesota, and it just sort of is what it is. A different culture would think that's crazy.
Well, that's the emphasis on the nuclear family that started when, like in the 50s, where the important unit was mom and dad and kids.
Mhm.
And it just seemed to, at that point, start not as important to be multi-generational.
Okay.
It was nuclear, and I wonder how that folds into the post-Christian world too. That's just how society started looking at.
Sure. And then once that happens, and there are changes there, once the unit becomes smaller and smaller and smaller, it's like you keep dividing something, and it's at a certain point, can it be divided any further before it breaks? When I was young, it was a kind of a surprise, but always noteworthy when a friend's parents got divorced. And the sense of having like, I get 2 Christmases, or I have to go, this is my weekend with my dad, or something like that. It was rare enough. I'm not going to say it didn't happen, because it definitely did. But it was rare enough that you kind of remembered who was who. Oh, those are the kids who, have to go to split households or whatever. If you went into a classroom today, you drive to Valley View 1 mile that way, Scott Lake Elementary that way. What percentage of kids right now in the random 4th grade class are from a split household? It's this huge number, and they don't even think twice about it. That's a pretty substantial change within a single lifetime. The Episcopal Church, and certainly part of the ethos of the Anglican Communion, I would say even 100 years ago, may have barred the divorced from communion. We have divorced and remarried bishops, sometimes with multiple. There's at least one that I know of who's been divorced and remarried. He's on maybe the 3rd one or the 4th one. I'm not arguing about the morality. I want to point out a change.
Yeah.
Where there was an absolute assumption, this is right, this is wrong. And over the course of a single century, let alone 15, 20 centuries, things seem almost inconceivably different.
Well, even then, when people would get married, it was more of a union based in faith and the values about why they were getting married. Whereas think about what's happened in the last 40 years. I want to marry a person and I'm marrying their resume. Or I'm, just the whole, when you get away from the Christian value set and move into the post-Christian world or postmodernism, the values that we assign to the partner we choose are so different, and I wonder if that's why we have more divorce anyway. They're not rooted in a growing of faith
Yeah,
or principle.
yeah, quite possibly. When you live in a culture that values finding, seek your soulmate, find a partner that really compliments you or that excites you or whatever. Well, how not just through time do we have to travel, we can still travel in mileage and find a culture where those marriages are arranged by your family members. And you hope you get along, but it's chosen for you, which seems completely foreign to us. But that's not a relic of, oh, that's from 1,000 years ago. I mean, there are places and countries right now. There might even be little enclaves within our own nation where families just assume, no, we'll choose for you because, is it better or worse one way or the other? Well, if we're going to argue that, what does our standard come from? We can say, well, I think arranged marriages are bad. Well, why? Someone who favors arranged marriage, we're just thinking about that. I'm not arguing the point. Just follow for a sec. That someone who does arranged marriage, I know someone, a friend from college, who basically chose to be in an arranged marriage, said, I want my family to make a choice for me because I know that I can sometimes make choices based off of, fleeting emotions, or I'm not always the best judge of my own character, but people who know me the best and have that kind of external objective view of me can actually see stuff about me that I don't like admitting. I don't like to admit that I am messy, or I don't like to admit that I can be cranky in the morning, whatever it is. But the idea is, who knows me better than me? Well, the people who love me, spend time with me, and can see me without the way that I can justify my own behavior. So you find somebody that you think is compatible for me. And as this was all being explained, it sounds super foreign, but I started to think, well, there's something kind of to that. The idea that there are some things about us we can't even see because we're too close to us. And it takes somebody on the outside to observe something about us that either we can't see or we don't like to see, therefore we don't see. Does that make sense? So on a case like arranged marriage, is it wrong? Well, we might say it is. We might say it's weird, or we might say, well, what about love? What about compatibility? And there's some pushback from the other side saying, well, this is the advantages it has to it. How do you make that decision? How would we make the decision? Is it better to be about like love and you finding who's compatible to you, or you trusting other people to find who's most compatible to you? How do you decide which is the better model? I'm up for suggestion.
Well, that's a tough one. Because I know I was raised in an atheist household, and so the values, well, first of all, my parents had open marriage, so marriage was a different sort of a model for me. And so the values that I was raised for in trying to marry somebody are very different than the ones I have now as a Christian. And certainly when I teach Reese, I always tell them kind is better than pretty. So, so those sorts of things where I think our society is saying, we gotta marry the most sexually attractive person, and they have to be this and they have to be that, where I'm like, Reese, you just want someone that just being with them gives you a sense of being joyful,
Yeah,
but also grounded and connected to God in a way. And so I think there's part of that too. It's like, oh, and also here, how often do we confuse passion and attraction for love when
sure.
they are not? So, sometimes having your family members who are removed saying, well, that's just infatuation, that's just a crush, that's just passion, that's
Right.
just attraction. Is everybody so worried about chemistry? Well, chemistry can also blow up.
You know, these become some kind of tricky notions when we stop and think about it. So, there's epistemology is the study and search for understanding truth. Metacognition is thinking about thinking, like examining your own thought process. Why do I think what I think? How do I think what I think? So you put those pieces together, and we can start examining. We didn't come up with not just our ideas, but our framework for ideas out of nothing. It comes from something. So, you know, before we get too far afield in the arranged marriage thing, the marriage that I just mentioned as an anecdote was a total disaster. Disaster. And we could say, well, you know, of course, because arranged marriages that sounds crazy. And it did end really, really badly. But what happens when you live in a culture where you start talking about, you know, finding your soulmate and love, and they're like, yeah, but what if she is not a good childbearer because you need children to work the field or you die? You know, what if he is not a good provider because when winter comes, if you don't have enough wood cut, you're going to die.
Get old.
Whoa, you know, so-and-so is really handsome and attractive, but he can't swing an axe. And maybe you live at a time where that's pretty dang important, you know? So we wind up judging things based off of our circumstances, sure. But when do we stop and think why we put the framework up that we do? So we can say, well, there's no need for arranged marriage because we're not living some kind of subsistence, small enclave where we're worried about the winter and bears. It's more important for you to find fulfillment in a marriage or partnership. Then the question becomes, okay, why? It can be real clear to say it's important if you live in a place where winter is harsh and you either cut enough wood or you die. Well, that's a clear one-to-one. Well, then you better marry somebody who's good at cutting wood. But we don't live in those times. So why have we chosen what we've chosen as a priority? Self-fulfillment, happiness, someone who treats us with respect, someone who makes us feel happy about ourselves. You know, where do those come from? They don't come from the ether. They come from something. But when do we stop and examine? Other cultures, even today, don't value the same things. Some of these are going to sound like kind of out there examples, but is there a reason why I don't want to eat a dog? Other cultures do. And I just can't get over it. And yes, I have dogs, but even still, does that make them wrong? Now we're starting to get into this sense of, okay, well, why do I think the way that I think? I'm still convinced I'm right. I'm not saying everybody is even, you know, every idea is good. I'm just saying it's one thing to say, well, that's weird and I won't do it. It's something else to say, but why?
Yeah.
But why?
Yeah.
What's my framework that says chicken okay,
Dog, no.
cat no? And with the understanding that not everyone's going to draw the framework in the exact same way, but if we have done that, then that might help us understand how we're approaching not just that issue, but a lot of issues. If, for instance, this is his first virtue, equality, that by some sort of ineffable definition, you are not better than me, but I am not better than you. Let's say we're all equal under the law. Just because, you know, I have good vision, that doesn't mean that I have laws that pertain differently to me than you. Just because you're a woman, it doesn't mean that there's going to be laws that do something good to you and bad to me. Just because I speak English, or just because I was born in Florida, or just because whatever. We have a, the equality of the law is supposed to say that no matter who you are, no one is above it. We are all equal underneath it, treated fairly. Why is fairness a principle that we all seem to relate to? Something bad happens in a sporting event. Something bad happens at a friend who tells us how they were treated in an office place. Because that's not fair, as though that makes any difference in the world. Children will get very upset. It's not fair. Now we can tell you life is not fair, but why not encourage children? Well, just take what you want. If you're stronger, take it. That is a principle that actually seems a little more natural. Do animals share and cooperate in that manner? No. I think I've had enough. Here, you have it. Oh, you were here first. So why do we do it? And why do we feel such indignation when it doesn't happen the way we think it ought to happen? So these are all very kind of vague and diffuse ideas, but what he's going to do is start breaking down. We've got a reason why we approach the world the way that we approach it. And some of the things that we completely take for granted are not universal. And they are not human experience from the beginning. This is another little aphorism. The natural state of man, humanity, is poverty. That sounds like I'm making an economic judgment. I'm actually not. I'm making an observation, an existential observation. If we were born on a desert island, what would you possess? Nothing. If there was no parent to feed you and shelter you, how long would you last? Not at all. We are born into this world with how much stuff? None of it. Now, depending on where we're born, there are other resources around us. Perhaps we were born in a hospital and there are beds and there's a room and there's air conditioning and there's medicine or whatever, but that's not the only place a human could be born. Maybe we had our mother give birth and the father standing right next to us. That's not the only way to be born. Maybe our mother held us in her arms, as the cord was cut. That's not the only way it can happen. Our natural state is having nothing. Everything that we have then comes from somewhere else outside of us. Starting to think then where these things come from can be a way for us to then order them rightly, but to also see where our perspectives are coming from as well. We have very strong opinions about stuff. And what's going to be real interesting is he will lay out these 7 reasons, I think there's 7 of them, are also the top reasons why people criticize the church. I'm not a Christian because, pick one of these: equality, compassion, consent, enlightenment, science, freedom, and progress. Use the contrary example. I am not a Christian because they don't treat people equally. How does the church not treat people equally in a way that might make a 21st century American angry? Pick anything you want. No moral judgment. What's an inequality? Someone might say, that's why I'm not a Christian. Homosexuality. They don't treat this transgendered person the way they treat somebody else. They're unequal. Get rid of it. Okay? Compassion. What might a 21st century American say about the church against compassion? The church is not compassionate. What could they say?
Don't care.
They don't care.
Take care of one another.
They won't take care of one another. Why don't they do anything for the poor? Well, there's a church on every corner. Why are there poor people downtown? If there's a church in every corner, couldn't they fix that? They cared when they actually fixed that. Okay. Consent. we can't, the powerful can't force themselves on other people. Well, why aren't they combating rape culture? I've heard that one. Enlightenment. Well, the church is backwards. Yeah, that's from like the Dark Ages when people thought that, spirits caused, headaches, and that you should drill a hole in your head and let the evil spirit out. But we know that we flip switches and electricity turns on. It's not magic. So all this mumbo jumbo you're talking about, you need the Enlightenment. What about science? The church is anti-science. It's talking about faith and stuff, not real things that you can measure. Freedom. The church wants to tell you what to do. Wants to tell you to do your money and with your body. It wants to tell you what you can and can't. No way, man. Progress. The church isn't progressive. The church isn't helping society to become a better place. The church is regressive. It's trying to take us back to some sort of past where women were just in the kitchen and men were only blah, blah, blah. Yeah. Do all these, does it sound like I'm making stuff up, or does it sound like I'm potentially quoting something you've heard somewhere else?
Absolutely.
Every single one of these has been used as an indictment of the church, comes from the church. And he's going to lay that out to us. To even talk about equality as something you have not achieved is to presuppose that equality is something worth having. Why? If I'm bigger and stronger than you, why shouldn't I just take what I want? Why should we be equal? I'm better than you, right? Who's to say I'm not? Why is that even a virtue in the first place? Except from the gospel. So these are the things. And again, I would just say we're going to spend some time seeing and hearing and figuring out some stuff where we will see one's greatest virtues are often our greatest vices. Our biggest strengths are often our biggest weaknesses. The stuff we're really good at is also the things that we tend to slip up on. And so I'm hoping for a very interesting few weeks where we start talking about some stuff that maybe even we inside of the church have forgotten. This is a church principle. This is a gospel principle. Before this, people thought differently, and now we completely and 100% take it for granted. But without the gospel, we wouldn't be here. So that's the plan. We will start off with chapter 1 next week. So if you'll read chapter 1 between now and next Wednesday, and we will go over it. That one is it's entitled The Night Before Christmas. We're a little bit early, but we're starting to get into the fall, kind of. So much as Central Florida can have fall. But we will start from there. And I think there's gonna be a lot of stuff for us to uncover and maybe either remember stuff we maybe knew at one point, or maybe discover for the first time some things that we have taken for granted yet have its basis in some very surprising but holy places. Anything else?
The bugs are quiet. What happened to them? They went away or what?
What?
The bugs, they're quiet.
The cicadas.
Oh, the scare. Yeah, I don't know.
Oh,
They've been right.
Yeah. If they're being quiet right now, let them sleep. Okay, thank you.